All right, thanks everyone for coming tonight. Welcome to Liberty Me. We're here tonight with Sheldon Richman. He's going to be talking about the American founding. This is the first in a two-part lecture series on the American founding. Tonight we're going to be talking about the period from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution and kind of comparing those as well. Sheldon Richman is Vice President of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He's the editor of their monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and he's the former editor of The Freeman. He's written on foreign policy, population issues, disaster assistance, American history, privacy, the Middle East, and just about anything else you can think of. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Sheldon. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope this will be interesting, provocative. I'll speak for just enough time, I think, to provoke Q&A discussion, and I hope we can have a good, lively one. I do want to talk about the Constitution, but I want to build up to the Constitution, so I'll be covering surrounding historical events, the Revolution being one of them, and the Articles of Confederation, which is actually the first U.S. Constitution. It's not known by that name, but you need to understand that in order to fully appreciate the meaning of the U.S. Constitution. Now, there's one thing I want to warn against is what is known as the Whig theory of history. That's W-H-I-G, which is a view that libertarians, I think, do fall prey to, at least up to some point in history, where they think that the general trend is toward improvement of political institutions and other things. For libertarians, this may stop at the progressive era, but before then, there's this sense that things are sort of getting better and better. And this, in one way, this is applied is with the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. In other words, there's this idea that there's sort of a law of history that the bad gets left by the wayside, and what continues onward are the good elements in any particular institution or whatnot. So to apply this to the Articles of Confederation, the idea is, and this is pretty standard view among historians, that the Articles were a failure, and that there was this inexorable move toward the next stage, which was the Constitution, which is then regarded by definition as an improvement over the Articles. After all, if the Articles were so good, they wouldn't have been replaced by the Constitution. Now, people don't often state it maybe that bluntly, but I think a lot of people, and including a lot of libertarians, take that view, and I want to cast some doubt on that. After all, there aren't laws of history. As methodological individualists and advocates of free will, libertarians believe that history is the result of human action. Individuals act in the face of alternatives. They have preferences, they have values, they have interests, and those are the kinds of things that they are attempting to achieve when they make various choices, and this happens in the political realm just as much. So we can't look at the move from the Articles to the Constitution as if it were some sort of locomotive of history just heading down the track inexorably, or human decisions being made all along the way. Now, another thing I want to point out, sort of as a preface about the Constitution, is that it's claimed by people of a wide variety of political views. I mean, almost anybody on the political scene will pay homage to the Constitution and claim to love it. I mean, it's beloved by all sorts of people, and these people, of course, depending on their own political views, give the oops, that's not what I wanted to do there, was it? Give the a different meaning depending on what their political views are. And there's this easy temptation to read values backward into the Constitution, to find the values you want to find. It's kind of like an ink blot or a scripture. You can kind of find what you want. Two people who this was said about are Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. The historian Merrill Jensen, who I'll be referring to during my remarks, a very good historian of the period around the Articles of Confederation, said the following: He says, once it was adopted, meaning the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, with two opposed ideas of what the United States should be, laid down two classic and contradictory opinions of the nature of the Constitution. The two basic interpretations may be stated. Jefferson held that the central government was sharply limited by the letter of the Constitution, that in effect the states retained their sovereign powers except where they were specifically delegated. Hamilton argued, in effect, that the central government was a national government which could not be restrained by a strict interpretation of the Constitution or by ideas of state sovereignty. Now, I think you'll recognize the libertarian position in this summary of Jefferson's view of the Constitution. You know, that it's sharply limited the powers of the central government, and therefore left the states with their so-called sovereign powers. And Hamilton is generally seen by libertarians as as one of the bad guys of American history. But the interesting thing I want to point out about this is that, don't forget, Hamilton and Jefferson were having their clash at a time when the ink on the parchment was barely dry. So they, at least sometime, couldn't agree on what this document meant, even though it was that fresh. I mean, it had only recently been written and circulated and voted on, debated at length, as you know, and then eventually ratified. And those two guys had very different views of what it meant. Now, you know, we may like what Jefferson came up with, but how do we know Jefferson was right? And why would Hamilton necessarily be wrong? What is it about the Constitution that allows for this kind of disagreement? I think I want to try to shed some light on that. So let's first go back before even the Articles of Confederation, just to set a little bit of historical context here. In the colonies, we see a manifestation of what's known as the iron law of oligarchy, which means that, you know, in any organization, society, even a small, you know, club, typically a relatively small group, a small subset of the entire group, sort of gravitates toward the governance of the group. There will always be a relative few who are sort of most interested in taking a hand in the day-to-day governance of whatever it is, whether it's a society or a social club. Most people are busy making a living, raising families, doing taking care of the various, you know, cares of the day, day in and day out, and don't have the time or inclination to be as involved as this small group will tend to be. So that's just known in sociology as the iron law of oligarchy, and it applied to each of the colonies. In each of the colonies, over time, an elite emerged that tended to have its hand most firmly in the governance of that colony. And so the elites differed culturally from colony to colony, depending on the region. In the South, the elites tended to be the major planters, right? The owners of the plantation, the large plantations. Outside the South, it tended to be the merchants and perhaps people involved in the law. And their positions became entrenched over time, just the way we'd expect. I mean, this is just the way it works in many places and many times. So, you know, old times, I suppose. And so vested interests become formed, and the people who are outside or who are excluded, and don't forget, in the colonies, people who didn't own property did not have the same advantages as people who did own property, and so there were sort of ins and outs, and that creates rivalries and resentments. And on the part of the outs, it does create a desire for change, and even fundamental change. So in other words, you had two groups that Jensen calls the conservatives on the one hand, or we may also think of them as the Democrats, and the radicals on the other hand, as we may think of as the Democrats, be in the sense of being anti-aristocracy. there were aristocracies throughout the colonies. And of course, the background of their power was the crown, okay, as part of the British monarchy. So this leads Jensen to observe that when revolution was in the air, and of course it was an intellectual revolution before it became a military conflict, there were internal and external aspects to this revolution. Externally, you have the radicals first who want to break away from and be independent of the British Empire. But that went hand in hand for them with their desire for an internal revolution to break the hold of the aristocracies in the various colonies and to have a more decentralized, democratic, we might even think of it as a populist approach. This was not purely libertarian. I'm not making that claim. They may have been more libertarian than their opponents, but that didn't mean they didn't want government to be rather active at the local level. That's sort of a different issue. So you have these two revolutions really going on at once, internal and external. The radicals are for breaking from the British Empire first. They first propose it. And by and large, the conservatives are against it because they feel that's the source of their power, and they feared they would lose it, or it would be eroded or badly diminished if they did not have the backing of the British. But over time, the conservatives come around to the independence position because of the various abuses inflicted by King George, arbitrary power, closing of the port of Boston, intolerable acts, interference with trade, things of that nature, stamp tax, stuff like that. And so the conservatives end up becoming pro-independence, so they join the radicals to that extent, but they certainly don't join the radicals over the issue of breaking the internal aristocracy. And so, in fact, the conservatives switched their program from maintaining membership in the empire, because it helped to maintain their power, to breaking from the empire and recreating the power without British backing at home. Recreate it with them being fully in charge and not even having to answer to a royal governor or some other royal authority. So it was a desire to replicate the British political economy, which was a mercantilist economy, of course, with them in charge. So for the conservatives, not necessarily for the radicals. It's a little complicated there, but for the conservatives, the revolution was seen, at least in part, as a battle between what they saw as a mature empire, the Brits, and a rising empire, or what George Washington called an infant empire, namely what would be the United States. Okay, so that's the background. Now there's a Continental Congress, right? There's two Continental Congresses where the states have sent delegates, and they decide to draft the Articles of Confederation, which would be this loose association of these soon-to-be states. They were still colonies at the time. In preparation, war was going on. Let me bring up a timeline here that will make this more clear. So let's see. Oh, that's backwards. There we go. So here is our timeline. Whoops, I gotta get this thing out of the way. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we have the Articles of Confederation being adopted by the Second Continental Congress on that date, November 15, 1777. So the war is on. The Articles were being drafted in the Continental Congress while at the same time that the Declaration of Independence was being drafted and debated. So this is all going on at the same time. The Articles then take effect after ratification by the 13 colonies, soon-to-be states, in March of 1781. Cornwallis surrenders in October of 1781. So you can see that there's some time. The Articles are actually adopted while the war's still going on. Treaty of Paris isn't signed till 2 years later, 1783. And then just to jump now, in 1787, and I'll get into this in more detail, the Continental Congress calls for a convention to revise the Articles. I stress that word, revise. I'll talk about that. And then in 1787, the Federal Convention, or what was known as the General Convention, what we call it the Constitutional Convention, begins. In September of that year, the Constitution's approved and the convention adjourns. It then goes to the states for ratification, and by March 4th of 1789, the Constitution takes effect. The Bill of Rights is then adopted as amendments to the Constitution by the first Congress in 1791. So let's talk about the Articles of Confederation. What did they have in mind? Well, there wasn't a whole lot of support back then for anything more than a relatively loose confederation, which is why it's called the Articles of Confederation. So there wasn't strong support for a big national government, which would, by nature, de-emphasize the states. There was an attempt at this. John Dickinson, a Pennsylvania delegate, member of Congress, drafts an article, proposed articles, which would have had a fairly strong central government with an executive committee, not a single president, but an executive committee ruling, and then a Congress. So this discussion of what kind of confederation there should be begins with Dickinson's strong bid for a strong central government. However, he's turned back. He's turned back by a member of Congress by the name of Thomas Burke, who had enough support to win the day, and he proposes an amendment which ends up creating what it is that they got, which was a very weak central government, if we want to call it that for the moment. I would call it a quasi-government. And the states, basically, the colonies, which would become states, as essentially sovereign individual states that were just in this league with other states, but had not surrendered its own sovereign powers. It would still maintain really total power to govern internally, and only external, or what they called general considerations, would be turned over to this national government. The key, bring up a slide here. The key article that made sure it went the way Burke wanted it to go, rather than Dickinson wanted it. Okay. Is this Article 2, which is very important because they're going to compare it to language in the Bill of Rights. It seems to resemble language you may be familiar with. But note the strength of this Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation. Each state retains its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, enlarge that, jurisdiction and right, which is not by this confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. So this is critical to this is what made the Articles of Confederation really what they were. The fact that it boldly declared that each state retains its sovereignty. So two things are also worth noting about the Articles of Confederation. Two things that are absent from the Articles, as opposed to this, which is present. The Articles of Confederation did not give the national, what I'm calling quasi-government, the power to tax. No power to tax whatsoever, and no power to regulate trade in any way. It's not mentioned. That's pretty significant, I think, from a libertarian standpoint, that there was this creation of a government that had neither the power to tax nor the power to regulate trade. So the reason I wanted to call it a quasi-government is I'm not sure it can be really a government if it doesn't have the power to tax. It seems to me the power to tax is an essential quality. It's an essence of government. Without that, I don't think you have government. Now, I call it a quasi-government because it did get its money through taxation, but it got it through the state's power to tax. So it had to requisition money from the states. And the states, of course, could use the power to tax. So it was like a second-order power of taxation, but it had no direct power of taxation. That's pretty significant. And also the power to not no power to say anything about trade. That also is. I don't know that there's another government anywhere that lacked that power. Now, if we step back for a second, we might want to say, as libertarians, we might want to say, you know, when they dumped this document, which I'll talk about, what the heck were they thinking? They dumped a system where the central government, quote unquote, could neither tax them nor regulate their trade. Why didn't they leave well enough alone? Even if there were some problems, figure out how to work them out. But why the backslide? See, that seems to be as a backslide, contrary to the Whig notion that it's always onward and upward, improvement, constant improvement. That doesn't seem like an improvement. Libertarians certainly shouldn't regard it as an improvement. I guess there are statists who would regard it as an improvement. But we should not regard it as an improvement. So that's a little bizarre. Now, like I said, the Articles of Confederation was pretty bare bones. There were powers, more powers than even I'd like. Post office, for example, but there wasn't a lot to work with. However, there were people in the Congress who thought maybe more power would be useful. James Madison, who was in this Second Continental Congress when the Articles took effect, was one of those people who thought there should be more of a central government, a strong central government. He was not alone. And these people made various proposals over the years to bolster the power. First of all, they tried to find powers, implied powers, in the Articles of Confederation. They didn't have a whole lot of luck. They tried, didn't get them anywhere. Then they would propose amendments sometimes. So Madison proposed an amendment in 1781 where he said a general and implied power is vested in the United States in Congress assembled to enforce and carry into effect all the articles of the said Confederation against any of the states which shall refuse or neglect to abide by such determinations. See, sometimes the states weren't being cooperative. They wouldn't send in the money, or they wouldn't go along with something else that the Congress wanted to do. So here's Madison attempting to, and there wasn't much the Congress could do about that. So Madison is trying to remedy that by putting in language in the Articles that declared that there was a general and implied power. Those are his words. Now, it's very interesting. I want you to pay attention to that term, implied power, because that's going to come back, and we need to hold Madison's interest in implied powers up against his reputation for being against implied powers. He's the guy that said the powers of the U.S. Government are few and defined, according to the Constitution. When he was trying to sell the Constitution in the Federalist, he claimed they were few and defined. And yet, on more than one occasion, he's arguing for implied powers. So I believe that Madison, contrary to what conservatives believe, Madison is the father of the implied powers doctrine, which conservatives hate so much, and we should hate, because you can find if that doctrine then permits almost anything to be found in almost any language if you try hard enough. So I think Madison is the culprit. All right, so there were also attempts to give the national government some modest taxing power, like a 5% tariff. And there was some support for that in Congress, and a couple of times that amendment got sent out to the states for ratification, and it would fail because one state could hold it up. You see, we needed unanimous consent for any change in the Articles. Very important point. Keep that in mind. I'll be coming back to that. Okay. Finally, the centralizers, and there's centralization. There's a centralization movement going on in the country. The country was not made up of entirely of decentralists, libertarian types, populists, or whatever you want to call them. There was a move among, usually among the major economic powers, the merchants, and like I say, the major planters, to come up with a stronger central government. They did not like that the United States, and it was called the United States then, under the Articles, was not truly a nation. Because, you know, in their view, how can you be a nation if there's not a strong head that can have a tax policy, can have a trade policy, and other kinds of policies? They didn't like that it was just a loose confederation. They thought the United States, they could not accomplish their objectives, and the United States could not be a big leaguer, they might have said, with this pitiful quasi-government created by the Articles of Confederation. So there's a move to call a convention to amend the Articles. And that does gain steam. And finally, a convention is called for Philadelphia in 1787. But it's for the purpose of amending the Articles, and I stress that. Now, under the rules, if you amend the Articles, any amendment has to go out to the states and has to have unanimous consent. One state could hold things up. So the delegates gather in Philadelphia. There are centralizers there. There are decentralists there. Hamilton and Madison are the leading centralists. Jefferson, who might have been a vocal decentralizer, was in Paris at the time, so he's not at the General Convention. One of the arguments made for strengthening the government while the revolution was still on was that how are we going to win the war unless we have more power? But as the war was beginning to wind down, and as success was in view, the centralizers began to panic because they thought we're going to lose this great argument. You know how even today war is the health of the state. Well, they knew that back then, even if they had never heard Randolph Bourne's great adage. But they did worry that with the end of the war, the immediacy of the need to give this national government the power to tax and other powers was going to fade. In fact, Robert Morris, who's a centralist, and one of the financiers of the American Revolution, said this amazing thing. He said, "A continuance of the war is necessary until we acquire the habit of paying taxes." So that's the sort of thing that was on the mind of what would come to be known as the Federalists, the group that wanted a strong central government. Okay, so they get to Philadelphia, and you do have this mix of delegates. No one side dominates and can dictate. But the Federalists, the centralizers, seem to have some edge in the strength of it. The working model that they begin with is Madison's Virginia Plan, and Madison's Virginia Plan was essentially what came out of the Constitution. I mean, came out of the Convention, the Constitution we know. Yes, there was some compromising of the language, some things that were more vague than maybe the centralizers would have wanted in order to satisfy the decentralists and the people outside who would have to eventually vote on this in their ratifying conventions. But they stuck to basically stuck to this plan, which created a muscular, certainly compared to the Articles of Confederation, a muscular central government and by necessity weaker states. So I want to just compare a little bit of text. I don't want to take up all the time because I really do want time for discussion. But let me let's see. I'm going to do some textual comparison here so you can get a sense of the flavor. We've already seen this this Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation. This very important Article 2. Each state retains its sovereignty. I want to highlight an aspect of this in red, so I can call attention to two key points in this Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation. Notice it says each state retains its sovereignty, and every power not by this confederation expressly delegated. It doesn't say delegated, but expressly delegated. That means it has to state that the power is delegated. Is retained by the states. So let's compare that. Now, no, there's no. Let me back up a step. There is no language like that in the Constitution. Nothing like that. Now, if that reminds you of anything, it reminds you of the 10th Amendment, which of course was not part of the Constitution. It was part of the Bill of Rights, which the first 10 amendments adopted after the Constitution was already ratified, had gone into effect, and the first Congress had met. So, remember, the Constitution itself, as first presented to the people of the new United States and to the states ratifying conventions, did not have anything like the language of this Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation. That's something that upset some ratifiers. They said, some of them did say, and the people at large, why isn't there a Bill of Rights? Why isn't there some declaration of the states' powers? And so you get a lot of writing back and forth about the problems with the Constitution. As you know, the Federalist Papers are the most famous collection of these. These are writings in defense of the Constitution and in favor of ratification by James Madison, by Alexander Hamilton, and to a lesser extent by John Jay. On the other side, you have people who are critical of the Constitution, become known as the Anti-Federalists, who are writing in newspapers. The Federalist Papers were originally newspaper columns. They only later got compiled into a book. But the people who we call the Anti-Federalists did this similar things, writing in the different state papers, picking away at the Constitution, saying there's a problem with this, there's a problem with that. I'll go over some of their objections pretty soon. But what I'm going to do here is jump ahead to the centralists, Madison's attempt to remedy or satisfy the people who complained that there was no Article 2 like this in the Constitution, Article 2 as it appears in the Articles of Confederation. So there is an attempt to. Oops. Let me get to my slide here. In the 10th, what became the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Let me go back one. Yeah. Okay. It was originally actually the 12th Amendment. The Congress reported out 12 amendments, only 10 got ratified. So what was 12 then became the 10th. The power is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Now this is this 10th Amendment is often emphasized by conservatives and other constitutionalists as claiming that not all the powers were delegated to the central government, and the states still retain sovereignty. So there's therefore people defending nullification, secession, and whatnot on the basis of the 10th Amendment. But I want you to notice how weak that language is compared to the language of the Articles. The Articles did talk about sovereignty, and it did talk about expressly delegated powers. In particular, oops. The missing pieces when you compare it to the Articles of Article 2 of the Articles of Confederation is we don't have the word expressly before delegated, and we have the word reserved, not retained. Now that may seem like a small thing, but it isn't really. As it's been pointed out, I have this little slide here, retained suggests that something that you already have is kept. Okay, so it said the states retain their powers. Reserved does not necessarily mean these were pre-existing powers. And the 10th Amendment says that anything not delegated to the United States, namely the national government, is reserved to the states. So it doesn't have the same meaning that the pre-existing powers of the states are retained, except for a couple of powers given to the central government. It seems to say that any powers not delegated are reserved to the states. But that leaves open the whole question of what's delegated and what's not delegated. That is not a clear-cut, easily answered question, and Madison and Hamilton did not believe the Constitution answered it. They believed that would be worked out in the political arena in the coming years. They did not think they had answered these questions about what powers were left to the states and what was delegated to the national government. And it's not true they thought that they said, but it's clear that they didn't really believe that everything, that the only powers the national government could exercise are ones that are expressly stated. I mean, I hear people say this all the time, that the federal government may not exercise any power not expressly enumerated in the Constitution. They did not really believe that. It's clear. Because just take an example. How about the power of eminent domain? Now, notice that if you go to the Bill of Rights, the Fifth Amendment says that refers to eminent domain in the following way. It says, nor may private property be taken for public use without just compensation. But that's the first mention anywhere of the power of eminent domain, which means it was an implied power in the Constitution itself, and the Fifth Amendment was just adding some limit to it. So there was a power that was definitely meant to be implied, and there were other such powers as well. Okay, so here's an interesting story. While the 10th Amendment was being debated, or what was the 12th, was being debated in Congress, first in committee and then in the Congress of the whole, a representative from South Carolina named Thomas Tudor Tucker rose to amend the amendment. He proposed that the word expressly be placed in Madison's language, to say powers not expressly delegated to the United States by the Constitution, etc., are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. But Madison would have none of that. Madison opposed that, and according to the record, he argued that it was impossible to confine a government to the exercise of express powers. There must necessarily be admitted powers by implication, unless the Constitution descended to recount every minutia. In other words, Madison was saying we cannot place the word expressly before delegated, as it was in the Articles, because that would limit the national government only to express powers, and that's ridiculous. Any constitution has to have implied powers, or else you'd have to have this endless list of every little power it has. Once again, confirming my assertion that Madison is the father of the implied powers doctrine. So conservatives need to understand that Madison is not really their friend. He seems to have been the root of so much of what they complain about today. Well, okay, I'm going on too long. Needless to say, this Constitution ended up being approved by the convention. But an interesting thing was added to at the end. As I told you, to amend the Articles of Confederation, you needed the unanimous consent of the states. Okay, it had to be unanimous. But these guys didn't amend the Articles. When they got to Philadelphia, they locked the door so the public couldn't watch what was going on, and they tore up the Articles. And they started from scratch, Madison's plan, Madison's Virginia plan. And then at the end of the Constitution, of the proposed Constitution, they set new rules for adoption. Instead of unanimous consent, they said that states, through special conventions, not through state legislatures, through special ratifying conventions, only 9 would have to ratify in order for the Constitution to take effect. So they changed the rules. Albert J. Nock, the great libertarian, author of a great book, 1935 book called Our Enemy the State, calls this the coup d'etat, Philadelphia coup d'etat. I don't know. He seems to have a good point there. So it then goes out for ratification, but you have this group known as the Anti-Federalists who come along and they start complaining. They start issuing complaints. They argue that the preamble, "We the people," they thought this was supposed to be a confederation of states. Why does it say "we the people"? They complained that the taxing power was open-ended and comprehensive and extremely dangerous. These people were saying this at the time. Compare what they're saying to how history has developed and tell me whether you think the Anti-Federalists were onto something. They thought the taxing power was wide open, that the Congress could basically tax anything and in any manner. They thought the General Welfare Clause was, again, you could drive a Mack truck. They didn't have Mack trucks in those days, but you could drive a horse and carriage through. They thought the Necessary and Proper Clause was a blank check. They thought the Supremacy Clause was similar. They thought the federal government's ability to grab control of the militia was dangerous, that it would lead to a standing peacetime army. They thought there were ambiguities in implied powers. They thought it was needlessly complex. They were, in my view, they were prophets. I think their predictions of what would happen came true. The Constitution was ratified. There was some hanky-panky in the states about ratification, which I can't go into. Eventually, it's ratified. The Constitution goes into effect. We have George Washington as the first president under the Constitution, and as they say, the rest is history. However, I would like to end on the note by Lysander Spooner, the great abolitionist who wrote an essay I recommend to you called "No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority," that he said, whatever the Constitution may be, this is a loose quotation, whatever the Constitution may be, one thing is certain. Either it authorized the government we have, or it was powerless to prevent it. In either case, it's unfit to exist. So I think I've spoken enough, or more than enough, and let's have questions and conversation.
Thanks so much. This has been great already. I'm, as some people may notice, stealing Jeff Tucker's office right now. But if you'd like to ask a question, you can click the questions tab on the right and then ask a question in text there. Or if you'd like to ask a question on video, you can click chatting in the upper right above the chat window, and then click start your webcam, and I can bring you on screen. All right, Stephen Kinsella brought up an interesting point in the chat down here. He said that this was great and that you changed his mind on a lot of this. However, he disagrees that there's a Fifth Amendment implication of the power of eminent domain. So he says the Bill of Rights was not a grant of power, but limitations on federal power. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure we're differing. It seems to me if you say just out of the blue, and not in the Constitution even proper, but in an amendment, that the federal government can't take private property for public use without just compensation, it's putting a limit on an implied power, because the power of eminent domain is not specified in the Constitution. So what the heck is the Fifth Amendment talking about? It assumes there's power to take private property, but it's now placing limits on it in case there's any misunderstanding, right? It's got to be for public use, although we know what happened to that language over the years, right? They've taken private property for shopping malls and industrial parks, and there has to be just compensation. So it was limiting a power, but the power is not specified anywhere, so therefore it was limiting an applied power. I'm not sure I'm disagreeing with Stephen.
He says in chat that the Ninth Amendment specifies the enumeration of rights. The enumeration of rights cannot be construed to disparage others. So he says that your interpretation of the Fifth Amendment contradicts the Ninth because it's tries to stop it.
Well, I think you're gonna have to take this up with the framers. I mean, I can't resolve their contradictions. It's true. They say the listing of some rights should not be construed as disparaging or denying other rights retained by the people. So why is the Fifth Amendment language there about you can't take private property for public use without just compensation? It sounds like you can take private property for public use with just compensation. Why would you say that? I can't straighten out all their contradictions. I'm afraid I'm going to have to plead, I don't know what, ignorance?
Definitely not the fifth. Stefan says he agrees with contradiction.
I'll plead the other part of the fifth.
Elijah Stanfield asks, let's see, did you go over any of the personal interests of George Washington may have had in the formation of the federal government's power?
I didn't go over personal interests. That's a big subject. I would have talked long beyond what I did. Washington was one of the major land speculators, and many of the members of the General Convention were speculators in government debt and wanted to make sure the debts would be paid, and they felt that a strong central government would be a better guarantee that the debts would be paid. You do have a lot of interest going on there, but no, I did not go into that.
Wesley Matthew asks, was the amendment process meant to be used whenever the government needed to expand its power rather than using judicial rulings?
Well, what was it meant? That refers to individual minds, so different people probably meant different things. Madison and Jefferson and Hamilton say things in the Federalist Papers that strongly suggest, I mean, it may even be explicit, I don't have the language handy, that the many ambiguities would be worked out in the political realm. And I don't think that necessarily means the amendment process. I think they knew there would be cases, there would be arguments between states and the federal government that would go to court, and or there would be just political fights that would work these things out. They did not believe it was a finished document. It was intentionally vague in places. It was a political document. It contained some compromise language, and the Federalists, who became the Federalists, I think were confident that they would, and they did rule for the first 10 years, that they would be able to establish a lot of precedents and get their way on a lot of things. Now, some of the stuff was undone later when the Republicans get in, when Jefferson gets in. By the way, on this issue of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, there's just a quick anecdote about that. There's a funny story. You might wonder, why were the strong central government advocates called Federalists and the people that wanted a weak central government and strong states called Anti-Federalists? Well, it's because the people that we call Federalists had a great public relations sense. They grabbed the word very quickly. They knew it was a popular word. The dirty word was consolidated government. So they called themselves Federalists, and then they called their opponents Anti-Federalists. Now, this was put in perspective by Elbridge Gerry, who was an Anti-Federalist in Massachusetts during the ratification process, when he remarked about this and said, this is an odd use of terms. He said, we should really identify people by whether they're ratificationists or anti-ratificationists, or for short, the rats and the anti-rats. So I think that was the right spirit.
In law school,
so I'm an anti-rat.
I always had to explain to people that while I was the president of the Federalist Society, I was not by any stretch of the imagination a Federalist. Georgia Marvin asks...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say one more thing. I sound favorable to the Articles of Confederation. That was way too much government at the national level for me. And at the state level, you had pretty powerful governments doing all kinds of things, mercantilist sort of things, and giving grants and granting corporate charters, special favors, subsidies, poor laws. Those were not libertarian by any stretch. And if you're an anarchist, of course, they were too much. So I'm just only, in comparison, saying nice things about the Articles of Confederation. I'm not making any absolute judgments about it. I am also leery of local power, and we have to be sensitive to the idea that America's history, which beginning with slavery and then through Jim Crow and all that rotten stuff, has tarnished otherwise honorable concepts, and I think it hurts libertarians. Because when you talk about decentralization, I don't like the term states' rights, but if you talk about decentralization, nullification, you don't like the strong central government. Some people don't hear that the way libertarians hear that, because they remember the days of slavery. Some of the anti-federalists, certainly in the South, were afraid that a strong central government would break up slavery, would break the slave system, and they didn't like that. Some of the northern advocates of centralization had as maybe one of their purposes the breaking up of slavery. So breaking up of slavery is a good thing. But I generally don't like centralized power. So there is this sort of tension there. I am not a fan of local tyranny. I wanted to make that clear. Anyway, go ahead. Let's go to the questioners.
I think there's a tendency of a lot of libertarians have to romanticize things that lost out to big government, like the Confederacy and like the Articles of Confederation, and to pretend that they were more libertarian than they were. But I mean, really, it's not that those things were good. It's that the things that won, the big government statism, was just terrible. George Marvin asks, so within the context of the Articles of Confederation, is there anything equivalent to the Bill of Rights on behalf of the individual?
Well, there was no Bill of Rights. The states had Bill of Rights, and one reason some people in the states demanded a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution was that they had them in their state constitutions, and they just wondered, hey, don't constitutions have bills of rights? And, you know, Hamilton's answer was, well, you don't need a Bill of Rights. If the government can only do what's the powers, exercise the powers delegated to it, then it can't do anything else, and therefore can't violate rights. That wasn't satisfactory to a lot of people. So I don't think anyone called for a Bill of Rights on the part of the national government under the Articles, because maybe it's because there was just so little power. Maybe someone was calling for it, and I'm not aware of it. But there was much more focus on the states in those days because the national government was so bare bones.
Wesley Matthew asks, how much strength or influence did the Constitution give the judicial branch compared to the Articles of Confederation?
I think under the Articles there were some judicial powers that were exercised by the Congress for disputes between states, and possibly between citizens, of different states. No, the major judiciary was state judiciary. There was not a separate, just like there was not a separate executive branch under the Articles, there was not a separate judicial branch. I'm not hearing you, Matt, but I can read it.
Yeah, would we have been far better off with our personal liberty and freedoms if the Articles of Confederation had been maintained and the Constitution had not been adopted?
Well, this gets to the point I was making earlier. It's a mixed, local. The only thing I can really say in favor of local government or decentralized government is that the cost of voting with your feet is brought down considerably if the government is at the state or even lower level, right? It's cheaper to move from a town to another town or from a state to a state, even in those days, than it would be to leave the country. So the only advantage I can really think of decentralization is that exit is cheaper. That's a good thing, because that to some extent puts some pressure on the jurisdictions. If they raise taxes too much and people and businesses start to leave, that may exercise some cause them to exercise some restraint and say, well, look at the outflow of people and businesses. Maybe our taxes is too high. So there might be a competition, a race to the bottom as far as regulation and any intervention is concerned. In the case, I'm not obviously speaking of some libertarian situation, but just your typical local and state government. On the other hand, the danger is that there's no sort of higher power like a national government to come in and say strike down Jim Crow laws or black codes. So local governments or state governments may get away with stuff that I don't like. Slavery would be the most glaring example. So, as long as I think this goes to the ultimate anarchist argument. As long as there's government existing at any level, there's danger, and that's the key issue, not exactly what level it is. Although, like I say, there's some advantages to having it more local because it's cheaper to escape.
Last week I was actually looking at a left anarchist blog, which is not usually where I look for pearls of wisdom, but I think they put it very well. Exit is a great thing, possibility, but it's not your first option. It's out of necessity. It's kind of the last resort. Wesley Matthew asks, was the creation of an independent federal judiciary an expansion or a check on centralized?
In some cases it was one, in some cases it was the other. I mean, obviously you can find cases where the courts have struck down laws that libertarians were glad to see get struck down, but all too often they have affirmed bad stuff. Certainly in the national security area, the federal courts have essentially rolled over. There are a few exceptions, but too often in things like that, and in other areas, the federal courts have said, we don't want to get between the two political branches. This is for the two political branches to work out, so we're staying out of it. So it's mixed. It's a mixed story, like most things. Most things are complicated, so is that.
Yeah, I think my favorite dichotomy there is, you have the Lochner versus New York case decided by the Supreme Court, and they find that the liberty of contract is implicit in the due process clause. And then you have 20 years, 30 years later, you have, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I forgot the name. A guy growing his own.
Yeah, you got
weed.
Yeah. Wickard v. Filburn.
Wickard v. Filburn. Yeah.
Well, let's keep in mind though that the Lochner case grows out of a state law though in New York, not out of a federal law. So they weren't limiting federal power in Lochner. They were limiting state power. So that's a mixed blessing. I mean, on the one hand, it's a good thing Lochner fell, but it also meant the federal courts now were maybe it wasn't the first time perhaps, but could reach into the states. Madison wanted a provision in the Constitution that would let the Congress strike down state laws. He couldn't get it, but he wanted it.
Yeah, the enemy of my enemy may be useful, but he's not necessarily my friend.
Either way, there are dangers. This is one of the, I think, one of the anarchist arguments. Either way, there are dangers.
Herman Morris asks, how was public service addressed by the framers in terms of compensation, full-time versus part-time, etc.?
Oh, I guess I really don't know the answer to that, so I'm gonna have to duck that one. It's not something I've taken a close look at. Sorry.
We'll make it a last call for questions here, but I want to let everyone know that Sheldon is coming back next week to do another talk on the American founding. The subtitle for that one is Empire on Their Minds, so you kind of have an idea of where he's going with that. Sheldon, would you like to give us just a little, 60-second preview of what you're going to be covering?
Sure. I'm going to take a look at the thinking of some important founders and important figures in the early years of the Republic and even pre-Revolution, indicating that the idea of establishing a new empire in the New World was on their minds. I'm not saying it was on everybody's mind in the country, but certainly the principles, and there was a great deal of support for it among the people. I kind of mentioned this earlier when I said that the conservatives, as the revolution was coming on, or as it was on, were thinking of the revolution, at least in part, important part, as a battle between a mature empire and a new rising empire in the New World, what Washington called the infant empire. So I want to show that was a widespread view, and that the idea that the U.S. The founding was anti-empire is not true. It was anti-British Empire, but that's not the same as anti-empire.
Thank you so much for talking to us tonight. I'm definitely looking forward to next week. This has been really great. All right, thanks everyone for coming tonight. Welcome to Liberty Me. We're here tonight with Sheldon Richman. He's going to be talking about the American founding. This is the first in a two-part lecture series on the American founding. Tonight we're going to be talking about the period from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, and kind of comparing those as well. Sheldon Richman is Vice President of the Future of Freedom Foundation. He's the editor of their monthly journal, Future of Freedom, and he's the former editor of The Freeman. He's written on foreign policy, population issues, disaster assistance, American history, privacy, the Middle East, and just about anything else you can think of. And so without further ado, I will turn it over to Sheldon. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope this will be interesting, provocative. I'll speak for just enough time, I think, to provoke Q&A discussion, and I hope we can have a good, lively one. I do want to talk about the Constitution, but I want to build up to the Constitution, so I'll be covering surrounding historical events, the Revolution being one of them, and the Articles of Confederation, which is actually the first U.S. Constitution. It's not known by that name, but you need to understand that in order to fully appreciate the meaning of the U.S. Constitution. Now, one thing I want to warn against is what is known as the Whig theory of history. That's W-H-I-G, which is a view that libertarians, I think, do fall prey to, at least up to some point in history, where they think that the general trend is toward improvement of political institutions and other things. For libertarians, this may stop to each of the colonies. In each of the colonies, over time, an elite emerged that tended to have its hand most firmly in the governance of that colony. And so the elites differed culturally from colony to colony, depending on the region. In the South, the elites tended to be the major planters, right, the owners of the plantation, the large plantations. Outside the South, it tended to be the merchants and perhaps people involved in the law. And their positions became entrenched over time, just the way we'd expect. I mean, this is just the way it works in many places and many times, so old times, I suppose. And so vested interests become formed, and the people who are outside or who are excluded, and don't forget, in the colonies, people who didn't own property did not have the same advantages as people who did own property, and so there were sort of ins and outs, and that creates rivalries and resentments. And on the part of the outs, it does create a desire for change, and even fundamental change. So in other words, you had two groups that Jensen calls the conservatives on the one hand, or we may also think of them as the Democrats, and the radicals on the other hand, as we may think of as the Democrats, be in the sense of being anti-aristocracy. There were aristocracies throughout the colonies, and of course the background of their power was the crown, okay, as part of the British monarchy. So this leads Jensen to observe that when revolution was in the air, and of course it was an intellectual revolution before it became a military conflict. There were internal and external aspects claim to love it. I mean, it's beloved by all sorts of people, and these people, of course, depending on their own political views, give the. Oops, that's not what I wanted to do there, was it? Give the a different meaning depending on what their political views are, and there's this easy temptation to read values backward into the Constitution to find the values you want to find. It's kind of like an ink blot or a scripture. You can kind of find what you want. Two people who this was said about are Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. The historian Merrill Jensen, who I'll be referring to during my remarks, a very good historian of the period around the Articles of Confederation, said the following. He says, once it was adopted, meaning the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, with two opposed ideas of what the United States should be, laid down two classic and contradictory opinions of the nature of the Constitution. The two basic interpretations may be stated. Jefferson held that the central government was sharply limited by the letter of the Constitution, that in effect the states retained their sovereign powers except where they were specifically delegated. Hamilton argued, in effect, that the central government was a national government which could not be restrained by a strict interpretation of the Constitution or by ideas of state sovereignty. Now, I think you'll recognize the libertarian position in this summary of Jefferson's view of the Constitution. You know, that it's sharply limited the powers of the central government, and therefore left the states with their so-called sovereign powers. And Hamilton is generally seen by libertarians as one of the bad guys of American history. Up at the progressive era, but before then, there's this sense that things are sort of getting better and better, and this, in one way, this is applied is with the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. In other words, there's this idea that there's sort of a law of history that the bad and gets left by the wayside, and what continues onward are the good elements in any particular institution or whatnot. So to apply this to the Articles of Confederation, the idea is, and this is pretty standard view among historians, that the Articles were a failure, and that there was this inexorable move toward the next stage, which was the Constitution, which is then regarded by definition as an improvement over the Articles. After all, if the Articles were so good, they wouldn't have been replaced by the Constitution. Now, people don't often state it maybe that bluntly, but I think a lot of people, and including a lot of libertarians, take that view, and I want to cast some doubt on that. After all, there aren't laws of history. As methodological individualists and advocates of free will, libertarians believe that history is the result of human action. Individuals act in the face of alternatives. They have preferences, they have values, they have interests, and those are the kinds of things that they are attempting to achieve when they make various choices, and this happens in the political realm just as much. So we can't look at the move from the Articles to the Constitution as if it were some sort of locomotive of history just heading down the track inexorably, or human decisions being made all along the way. Now, another thing I want to point out, sort of as a preface about the Constitution, is that it's claimed by people of a wide variety of political views. I mean, almost anybody on the political scene will pay homage to the Constitution. But the interesting thing I want to point out about this is that, don't forget, Hamilton and Jefferson were having their clash at a time when the ink on the parchment was barely dry. So they, at least some time, couldn't agree on what this document meant, even though it was that fresh. I mean, it had only recently been written and circulated and voted on, debated at length, as you know, and then eventually ratified. And those two guys had very different views of what it meant. Now, you know, we may like what Jefferson came up with, but how do we know Jefferson was right? And why would Hamilton necessarily be wrong? What is it about the Constitution that allows for this kind of disagreement? I think I want to try to shed some light on that. So let's first go back before even the Articles of Confederation, just to set a little bit of historical context here. In the colonies, we see a manifestation of what's known as the Iron Law of Oligarchy, which means that, you know, in any organization, society, even a small, club, typically a relatively small group, a small subset of the entire group, sort of gravitates toward the governance of the group. There will always be a relative few who are sort of most interested in taking a hand in the day-to-day governance of whatever it is, whether it's a society or a social club. Most people are busy making a living, raising families, doing all the taking care of the various, cares of the day, day in and day out, and don't have the time or inclination to be as involved as this small group will tend to be. So that's just known in sociology as the iron law of oligarchy, and it applied to the